We have got an amazing drug here. We've got an amazing treatment. We need to tell more and more people about it. And I did a house call at 1 in the morning 2 days ago. And I was driving there, and you would do this as emergency overnight stuff that I do occasionally. And the driver said to me, one of these calls is complete rubbish, he said. Because the drivers are quite medical, you know, I mean, they drive about and they're not medical at all, but they have an opinion on who you're going to see. And he said, that call, that 32-year-old that's got a rash in her legs from shaving, how in the hell can that be a house call? So I'm looking at it thinking, you know, he's probably quite right, because it is like he's got. And it was a chronic fatigue patient with a rash. And I said, listen, some of these guys can't even get out of bed. You know, we'll wait and see. So I went in to see the patient, and she did have a rash on her legs from shaving, with quite a red, you know, much, much more exaggerated and painful rash, because her immune system is more active. Now, it turned out, I'm talking about her, I said, you know, how long have you had this? Since I was 19, she's now 32. Somebody else can do the maths, but that's a few years. So she's had this chronic fatigue syndrome for that length of time, after an Epstein-Barr infection and all the rest of it, quite a kind of usual story almost. Turns out her father is a professor of medicine. Her brother is a psychiatrist. She's got as much medical backup as you're going to get. Never heard of LDN. I said, what do you do for your chronic fatigue? Her and her mother both said in unison, there's nothing you can do. I said, well, that's not true. And you know, we went through this, so middle of the night, I'm giving a lecture on LDN to the daughter of a professor of medicine, and I thought, you know, if she doesn't know about it, and with all that kind of backup, and having had chronic fatigue, which affects probably 500,000 people in this country, who could almost all, be helped by low-dose naltrexone, then we still have a big job in our hands to get the word out there. So it's not, you know, it's a fantastic story so far. Events like this, and the ones we've had in Glasgow, and the ones in America, are very, very good and very welcome. Any media coverage that we get is very good and very welcome, but we've still got a big job in our hands when people like that don't know anything about low-dose naltrexone. Linda asked me to do an overview of LDN, which involves a bit of the history behind it, which a lot of you will know, and people that come to see me have generally done a lot of research. And there is, make no apologies for the fact that there is a bit of a black hole here, because we haven't had enough research to really fill in some of these gaps, and that's a big part of what the LDN Research Trust does, trying to raise money, raise awareness to get research done. It is not easy. I am 5.5 years into a process of trying to get money to do an MS study in LDN. We've been through peer review twice, we've got everything up, they're ready to go, we just have to put the full application in. I need a consultant neurologist. I have a consultant neurologist, but he's in the wrong health board. Nobody in the Glasgow Health Board, none of the neurologists will support the study. Even though they say, you know, we'd like more research on LDN, we're saying, just put your name on that paper, you don't have to do any work whatsoever, give us your name, that allows the research and development of the trust to take indemnity, and we can go on with doing the study, and they won't do it. So, much as people say they would like to know more research, it's not easy, so that's the sob story over. Right. Naltrexone is a synthetic drug. I love natural things. I don't like drugs. I'd love to think there was some way of saying that this comes from the root of the goji berry. It doesn't. It's a synthetic drug. It was synthesised in 1965. Naloxone, which is its younger cousin, older cousin, has been around since 1919, something like that. And that's the stuff that gets banged into people when they have an opiate overdose. Naltrexone is stronger, actually, than naloxone. And they were searching for the Holy Grail, and the Holy Grail is an opiate that doesn't have addictive properties. And there's no such thing as an opiate that doesn't have addictive properties unless it's an opiate antagonist. In other words, it goes in and sits in the opiate receptor and does nothing. It just squats there, and it blocks other opiates. Now, that has limited use. The reason I wasn't afraid of prescribing naltrexone when I was first asked for it 6 years ago was because I had so much experience in dealing with addiction, and I knew this drug. I didn't think it was very good, and the drug users don't like it at all, because at 50 milligrams or higher, it blocks all your endorphins and makes you feel rotten. In fact, just last week I was in one of the drug centres that we cover, and I hadn't seen this particular guy for a couple of years, and I was asking how he was doing. He says, I saw you in the telly, you were talking about that terrible drug, what's it called again? And I said, naltrexone. He said, that's the one, that's a terrible drug. That's the way these guys view it, as the worst thing that could possibly happen to them. It's like a lobotomy. If you get high-dose naltrexone, it stops all your endorphins from working, and nothing is any fun. Nothing is, you don't have any highs or any lows, you're as flat as a pancake. So not surprisingly, the compliance is very poor. However, after a lot of research, he got the license in 1984 as a treatment for heroin addiction and also in America for alcohol addiction. It's been used for lots of addictions, gambling, shopping, all sorts of things. Yeah, but at the end, he's testified the shopping addiction. I'm going to give it to my wife. But the year before that, Ian Zagon at Penn State University actually published 2 articles looking at low-dose naltrexone and the fact that low-dose naltrexone had this strange impact, this different impact, and that it actually was increasing endorphins because it was in low doses, and there was a rebound increase in endorphins. And you know, he's now published hundreds of papers mainly about that. The blockade was short-lived; it's only 4 to 6 hours, which is important. And there's a rebound increase in endorphins, particularly methencephalin, but also beta endorphin. And Zagon decided to call this opiate growth factor. And he's got lots of papers on OGF, as he calls it. And Dr. Bahari read the science papers and actually decided that this might be something that had some use in clinical practice and started using it. He was also interested in addiction and started using it in some of his patients with HIV and AIDS and had very good results. Had great difficulty, great resistance to his work, great difficulty getting anything published, because there's one thing getting a study done, which is really hard. You've then got to get it published, and a lot of the journals wouldn't touch it. So he didn't get much published, but it wasn't because he wasn't trying to get the work done. He then started branching into autoimmune disease, particularly MS, but lots of other autoimmune diseases. And because of its work in HIV, I presume it became known as an immune booster, which is actually a bit of a misnomer at all. It's certainly an immune modulator, but I would hesitate to call it an immune booster. But that's what it's been known as, and if you go through the internet, you hear lots and lots about immune boosters. Yash Agrawal had produced a paper in Medical Hypothesis, which is one of my favourite medical journals, because you don't actually have to have done any work to get a paper published. You just have a good idea and then can justify it, and you can get this done. And lots of ideas in medicine are destroyed and never make it anywhere because of the resistance. The usual standard of, establishment will resist new ideas. So medical hypotheses I really like, and Yash Agrawal made the point that actually lots of things increase your endorphins. Chocolate increases your endorphins, exercise increases your endorphins. Doesn't necessarily do much for autoimmune disease. So endorphin increase on its own may not be the way that this works, because this drug is incredibly powerful and incredibly effective. So there may be another action, and he looked at much more what happens in the immune system and does this modulate. And he came up with this hypothesis that it was actually reducing what are called peroxynitrites, which are at the real coal face in the immune system. This is the chemical that does most of the damage. There are other chemicals, obviously, but this is the chemical that does most of the damage. So if LDN is reducing this, as well as having an effect on the opiates, then that could explain why it's so effective in so many treatments. So that would make it an immune modulator. It's a nice simple slide for you. Basically, the only thing you really need to know there is that peroxynitrites are the ONOs, O-N-O-O, and if anybody's come to see me in my clinic, they know fine well I was going about the ONOs, or the ONOs as we call it in Scotland. It's a combination of nitric oxide and superoxide, superoxide being a free radical. Nitric oxide is a perfectly normal gas, it's a signalling gas that's used throughout the body, but when they combine together, they produce these ONOs. And a bit of a less complicated slide is this one, where the immune cells, when they're active, are producing these two gases. It's a bit like Doctor Who, where the Daleks come up and they fire out these weapons. Our immune cells are loaded and ready to go into action. And that's absolutely fine that they're defending us against bacteria and viruses and fungus. But if they turn upon us, these weapons are extremely powerful. And if they produce nitric oxide and superoxide together, then these very quickly combine, I think I have to press it again, to produce these peroxynitrites, or the ONOs. Lots and lots of research behind this, lots and lots of scientific papers that would suggest that this is actually a very real phenomenon. And if, and we think, low-dose naltrexone is reducing this would explain to a large degree why this is such an effective treatment. Not that it doesn't modulate the endorphins, it definitely does. To measure this, and this led me down another path, where they actually decided we developed a test for ONO production, where we actually, if you have your peroxynitrites, they will often combine with, they do lots of damage actually. They damage DNA, they damage cell membranes, they damage enzyme systems, and the way they damage enzyme systems is to lock onto the amino acids and make the enzyme systems less efficient. So this is one of the ways they disable and kill bacteria. But the combination of tyrosine amino acid and peroxynitrate produces nitrotyrosine. So measuring ONOs, measuring peroxynitrates is possible if you can measure nitrotyrosine. So this is a nitrated amino acid. The N part of the ONO is attached to the amino acid. It's a biomarker that tells you about the presence of ONOs. Now it's not that there was lots of work done where it was measured in the cerebrospinal fluid, not lots of work, but a few papers where they measured it in cerebrospinal fluid. And most patients, anybody with MS will know that a lumbar puncture is something that you only want once in your life, or maybe not even as often as that. But, so you can't really do lumbar punctures every time somebody comes to your surgery to see what their ONOs are up to. But there are studies where people have done, they've done this, serial lumbar punctures, and on healthy controls. Serial lumbar punctures, mainly in Japan, where it's actually a part of a game show, that if you win, you get a lumbar puncture once a week for the rest of your life. No, but very useful research, because if we didn't have that kind of, very sadistic research, we wouldn't actually know that people with high levels of peroxynitrate, high levels of ONOs, 2 years later are the ones with the greatest clinical deterioration. So this could be an early warning sign to say if you've got high levels, and we do, if someone has a high level of peroxynitrates, high level of ONOs, nitrotyrosine, then we employ as much as we can to try and bring that down, because it could be that that will be protective to their tissues. So we developed a blood test, which is the obvious thing to do rather than, not that getting blood taken is very nice, but it's an awful lot nicer than getting your cerebrospinal fluid taken. So this is the obvious thing to do, and there have been no commercially available tests, but there are no commercially available laboratory tests. You can buy the kit, but nobody's done the work to say this is what it means. So we're in the process of doing that work. We're 3 or 4 years into the process of doing that work, and so we hope to have this available. We use it within our clinic, but we can't use it out with the clinic until we prove it. And there are some useful papers there. We've got a patent on it actually. Anyway, moving on from that. So this hypothesis by Yash Agrawal made much more sense to me as a clinician. I thought, yes, endorphins are important, but they go up and down, and there's lots of things that influence endorphins. That doesn't do what this drug is doing. This drug is doing amazing things. I had one patient with rheumatoid arthritis who was on steroids, and I would see her walking down the corridor to see me, and she was, if I took her off the steroids, there was pain in every step. And I was wanting her off the steroids so I could start her on the LDN, and we couldn't really get her off it. And I thought, bugger it, I'll just put her on the LDN and the steroids together, which you're not supposed to do apparently. I think that's wrong. And she was able to come off without any pain. And I thought, God, this stuff, is as powerful as the steroids. So, there's something going on here. Jared Younger is based at Stanford University, and it's really good to have Penn State and Stanford and some of these universities really involved in doing good quality research, because this is filling in the black hole that we've got, the gap in knowledge that we've got. Nobody in this country appears to be doing it, unfortunately, but there's certainly some of the American universities where they're very interested in this. And he's been doing work mainly in fibromyalgia, because fibromyalgia is an immune-related condition as well. But then there are so many immune-related conditions I couldn't have time to tell you them all. What he was looking at is the fact that naltrexone is actually what we call a racemic mix. In other words, there are right and left-handed molecules, and most things in nature have right and left-handed molecules, what we call stereochemistry. And he said their work were looking at the fact that each half of the naltrexone had different actions. The right-handed part was working on the opiate receptors, and the left-handed part was working directly on the immune system. This again made great sense to me, that there was a combination of an opiate blockade and immune modulation from this one drug. A lot of drugs, when you actually split them, you'll find it's only one half of the drug that's been active. And if anybody's on thyroxine, for instance, it's now levothyroxine, left-handed thyroxine that's used, because the right-handed part didn't make any difference. The drug companies will often use this to extend a patent. They'll half the drug and then market a new drug, which is actually half of the old drug. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't, because when you split the drug, sometimes you change the side effect profile, and certainly Prozac, fluoxetine, when they split that, they found that the active left-handed side was actually still active, but was causing heart disease, whereas the combination wasn't. So it still has to go through a lot of testing. So this concept of the racemic mix is important for people to understand, that there are right and left-handed identical mirror image molecules. Same molecules, but they're mirror image, but they're different shapes. So they'll fit onto different receptors. The right-handed one, as I say, produces the opiate blockade. 4 to 6 hours, and that causes this rebound increase in endorphins until you go to a certain dose. You get to a certain dose, and the opiate blockade blocks every receptor in your body and makes you feel just the way the drug addicts feel when they take 50 milligrams. They feel terrible. And that limits, so this opiate blockade actually limits how high we can go with the dose. The levonaltrexone, the left-handed naltrexone, works directly on the immune system. And one of the universities in America, not Stanford, but another university, have actually split it and are looking at levonaltrexone. This could be the best immune modulating drug ever. But it still has to go through all the testing in case it's got some, naltrexone is very, very safe. That's one of the things about it. But it could be that this split might not be safe, so it has to go through all the safety for the obvious reasons. But that could be a fantastic drug. Because what we normally do in medicine is we take a sledgehammer to the immune system and we go, sorry, that's all we can do. Sorry about that. I know we've helped you, but we've also given you huge side effects, but that's all we can do. With naltrexone, it's like taking a screwdriver and just modulating it, just changing it, just turning the volume down very carefully and leaving the person without many side effects at all, virtually none, but there are some, but having this huge benefit. So it's a massively important drug. It attaches to toll-like 4 receptor. Now we're going to hear from Rachel later on about toll-like 4 receptors. Toll is German for weird, because fruit flies that don't have toll-like 4 receptors look weird. I think all flies look weird, but apparently the Germans can tell the difference between a weird fly and a normal fly. So toll-like 4 receptors are there, and they are part of our early warning system. They're part of our radar. They pick up the presence of bacteria, particularly invaders, and they trigger the immune system. So by acting directly on them, this modulates the immune system and calms it down. Doesn't suppress it the way steroids do, and methotrexate do, and methotrexate does, and all these other drugs. It just turns the volume down. It just modulates it. So it reduces the inflammation in the body by reducing this. Now, and the cardinal sign of LDN working is reduced fatigue. The cardinal sign of increased immune activity is fatigue, which is one of the reasons why chronic fatigue syndrome is an immune-related condition. That's a kind of classic example. But with any of these autoimmune conditions, fatigue is a big factor. With MS, with rheumatoid, with any of these conditions, Crohn's, fatigue is a big factor. So fatigue measurement and asking patients about fatigue is one of the best ways to know, are we succeeding or are we not? Because if you reduce fatigue, you're succeeding. So the clinical implications of having this idea of the mechanism, how it works, is that actually there is no magic dose for anybody. Everyone has different doses. We start at low doses because we don't know if someone's going to hit opiate blockade. If you start at 3 milligrams, which is what I originally did, you might block them. But 2.5 milligrams might be brilliant for them. So a lot of people in the early days got, an opiate blocking dose and said, this doesn't work. This drug's not for me. It's not as good as it's cracked up to be. Other people got the dose and it was nowhere near enough to modulate their immune system, and they said, this drug doesn't work. It's not near, it's not as good as it's cracked up to be. This idea that 4.5 milligrams or 3 milligrams of the doses it's not true at all. The dose is very huge. I've got people on 0.5 milligram, I've got people on 25 milligrams. Everyone seems to have a different tolerance to the drug. So what we do is we start low and we aim to get it as high as we can before they hit opiate blockade, and then we bring the dose down 0.5 milligram and say, well, that's probably your dose. But it might be worth maybe in 6 months' time having another go, because at that point your brain and your body may have produced more opiate receptors and you won't block. So we want to get as much of the left-handed activity without kicking in and causing the blockade with the right-handed stuff. And any time dosing is another thing, because this take it after 10 o'clock at night or 9 o'clock at night or whenever is based on the idea that you'll get a bigger endorphin surge. But if it's not the endorphin surge that's making the effect, any time will be as good as night time. And that's what we find. Some people prefer it at night time, but a lot of the time, sleep disturbance is probably the biggest side effect, and you don't get as much sleep disturbance. You still sometimes get it, but you don't get as much if you doze in the morning. So we dose most people in the morning unless they find that it's better for them to take it at night time. So, but it leads me on to some of the myths that have developed, and the myths have developed because of the lack of research. It's the lack of knowledge. People fill in the gaps. It's a natural thing we do. We all do it. We don't know the answer. We actually make it up. And that's fine. You know, Gestalt, we like to have the actual answer. So if we don't know the answer, we think, well, this sounds like the answer. So a lot of things are developed, and lots of people have done their research, have been on the internet and come to me with very fixed ideas that I must take it at this time, it must be 4.5 milligrams, I need to get to that dose, even if I'm miserable, I must get to that dose. I can't take it with steroids, I can't take it with disease-modifying drugs. Of course you can, if you understand the mechanism of it. Steroids work a completely different way. They just flatten everything, they just block the enzyme that produces the hormones for both good and bad hormones, and they just flatten everything. Can't take them for very long, or you'll certainly suffer consequences, but you can certainly take LDN and steroids together. Can't be taken with opiates. Well, that's true during the 4 to 6 hour period where it blocks the opiate receptors, but you can take the opiates later on. So somebody can take tramadol last thing at night and LDN in the morning and they're fine. They're still, it doesn't have to be that we avoid opiates completely. But, and I was chatting to somebody about this, in fact it was you, chatting to somebody about this just over there. It is madness to take LDN and not look at your diet. Why? Because the diet, some parts of the diet, particularly saturated fat, particularly omega-6 fats, will actually stimulate your immune system and will actually increase immune activity while you're trying to decrease it. And not only that, saturated fat works on the toll-like 4 receptors. So you've got the same receptor getting mixed messages, one saying calm down, another one saying speed up. So it makes no sense not to look at your diet. It's madness not to look at your diet. It's your choice, but you'd be daft not to look at your diet. Omega-6 is much, much common in the diet and increases inflammation. Just any hormone derived from omega-6 is much more inflammatory than one derived from omega-3. Omega-3 has a modifying effect on the immune system and calms down the toll-like 4 receptors, as well as lots of other good beneficial effects. So it makes sense to look at your diet to take out what we call dirty foods. Dirty foods are foods that increase your immune activity, and dairy, number one in my book, but a lot of people have problems with lots of different foods, anything with highly colour in it, lots of pesticides in it. These things all stimulate your immune system. So to say, I'm a poor soul, I've got X, therefore I'm going to comfort eat, well, that's fine, but you're actually doing yourself a lot of harm by doing that. So I've covered this thing, actually. Diet basically can oppose LDN. You're not going to get the same benefit if you don't look at diet. So look at diet and be aware of it, and it's not complicated. The stuff that we've been eating for millions of years is good for us, and the stuff that they've just invented last week is not. Fruit and vegetables and salad and meat and fish are good for you, particularly fish. Part of the overview, I thought, well, I'll just mention some of the trials that have been done. Maria Gironi did a very good trial in primary progressive. Is it Jill Smith? Professor Jill Smith, isn't it? Yeah. Has done 2 trials. The second one is a double-blind placebo-controlled trial. Can't get published yet because it's too controversial, because it shows that it works for Crohn's disease. So they're having a bit of trouble getting that published, but they will eventually get it published. Jared Younger, as I mentioned, has done 2 trials in fibromyalgia. The pilot study was published in 2008, and the study that he's completed has not yet been published yet. I'm pretty confident that will, and that's a double-blind placebo-controlled trial, showing significant improvements in both fatigue and pain. And Jackie McCandless is currently doing, I think we're going to get an update on that, she's currently doing a trial in HIV over in Mali. So there's some stuff going on there, but nowhere near enough. The clinical uses of this drug, you couldn't get on one slide. I tried doing it before, actually, and ended up 2 slides and tiny wee writing that no one could read, so I just thought I'd do a few broad brush headlines. It's good for virtually every immune-related condition you can name. Autoimmune diseases, immune-related diseases, quite a lot of work, animal work anyway, on cancer. I think the cancer thing may well be through the opiate growth factor. I think Ian Zagon's right about that. I think that might be how it works in cancer, but there will still be an immune part, modulating part of that. HIV, we've mentioned, there's a study going on. Autism, very difficult to study, but there's no doubt that some autistic kids definitely benefit from having their immune system turned down. And finally, I just want to say thanks to a few people. To Bob Lawrence here, who has really, in the very early days, stuck his neck out way, way, way too far, and put his head above the sandbags and got shot at lots of times, and that's what happens, but we must thank him for being courageous enough to do that. Could you give Bob a round of applause? Linda, who is just an incredible source of energy and inspiration for everybody. So Linda. Stephen Dixon, I have to mention, because Stephen does amazing stuff creating this LDN, and you've no idea the dirty tricks that people get up to try and stop him doing it, but he still managed to do it. So we give Stephen a round of applause. And everybody that's involved in this, because we've got LDN Aware, as we know today, the LDN Research Trust, we've got LDN Now. I got an email yesterday to say that the Scottish Parliament, Stephen's going to go and I'm going to be on the telephone, are going to be considering LDN, but there's been petitions from the LDN Now to the Scottish Parliament. The British Parliament, I have to say, just said, look, I'm sorry, the drug companies do the research in this part of the world, away you go. The Scottish Parliament are very much more receptive to this. They think this could be a big saving, a very useful thing, so we'll let you know how that goes. But that's next Wednesday. Next Wednesday there's going to be a meeting at the Scottish Parliament. There's LDN for Cancer. I couldn't mention them all. Basically, we have something here which is not unique but incredibly powerful, and it's a story that needs to be told. We all have to tell it. We've got huge potential for this drug. We need more trials to convince those who need convincing, and that's always the way in medicine. When Louis Pasteur said, I think infection is caused by these invisible microbes that we can't see, they all thought he was mad. When George Lister 2 years later said, I think we should wash our hands before we actually operate, because maybe he's right about these bugs. And then maybe we should sterilise instruments in between patients. They all thought he was mad as well. This is what happens in medicine. You're considered a madman, and then a couple of years later, just when you're about to peg it, they give you the Nobel Prize. Bob, bear that in mind. It's a sort of consolation prize for getting beat up for 20 years. So that's the way it happens. We've got to remember, I think, the nutritional parts of this, the diet, omega-3, vitamin D, and I've just put at the very end there, CCSVI. I'm not going to talk about that, although I will be willing to take questions later on about that. This is yet another incredible development which has been hugely resisted and regarded as heresy, and will probably get Zamboni the Nobel Prize. And that's it. Thanks very much.